This is Tread Boldly, Leadership Lessons from the Saints with Father Nathan Cromly.
Hey, thanks for having me back again. Today I want to share with you about St. Paul as a leader, and especially an inspiring moment in his life that many people aren't quite aware of. Most people know that St. Paul faced imprisonment for Christ. Actually, at least 6 years of his life was spent in prison. And most people know that he was whipped for Christ, that he was scourged for Christ, 3 different times, that he was shipwrecked, etc. But what a lot of people don't know about St. Paul is a story that comes from his very first missionary journey at the end of his very first foray into evangelization. It happened in the town of Lystra at the end of his very first missionary journey. We read about it in the book of the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 14, verse 19. It says, "But Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. But when the disciples gathered around him, he rose up and entered the city, and on the next day went on with Barnabas to Derbe." The author of the Acts of the Apostles acts like it's not a very big deal. He just kind of puts it out there really plainly for us, right? That they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. But that's pretty dramatic. Stoning means that a group of men gathered around St. Paul in a circle and then lifted up rocks and threw them at him, striking him repeatedly until he was crushed down to the ground and in such a state that they thought he literally had died from the head wounds. No one survives a stoning. He's the only person in the entire Bible who goes through a stoning and yet continues to live. It's a way for people to be executed. And St. Paul literally faced that violence for the sake of Christ. Now, on the one hand, you could say, well, he had it coming to him because he had approved of the death of St. Stephen, who had died of a stoning, and maybe St. Paul saw that his suffering through this and even his death would in some way atone for his sin of having approved of St. Stephen being put to that same death at his hands. But be that as it may, it still took an incredible amount of courage. He could have changed his mind. He could have recanted his faith. He could have done anything to save his life, and he didn't. He preferred to die for Christ than to live without him. And he was knocked so unconscious that the crowd literally dragged his body out of the city and left it there to rot. It wasn't until the Christians came that St. Paul stood up again and then went back into the city. And what's more, all this took place at the end of St. Paul's very first missionary journey. He had just gotten started. He would spend many more years of his life evangelizing, but this first foray ended in disaster. The people rejected him to the degree that they stoned him to death for the sake of the gospel that he was preaching. Does that sound familiar for any of you? There's a lot of times in our life where we face defeat. And sometimes we face defeat right off the bat. You're trying a new sales position and you simply cannot get anyone to buy your product. You open a new business and the location ends up not being the best location. You invest your money in a new venture and the new venture doesn't pan out. And you find yourself in positions of loss, of grief, of suffering, and in what looks like inexorable defeat. Sometimes those who are single feel this way. When will I ever find a spouse? It's easy at moments like that to give up, but that's not what St. Paul did. Instead, St. Paul got up again and continued to preach. Even though he was facing such violent rejection for what he was doing, St. Paul continued forward. Why? Because of the one for whom he was doing it. If we live for ourselves, my friends, then we will lose energy when we suffer loss. But a Christian does not live for themselves. A Christian lives for Christ. We have a love in our heart that's deeper than any of the pain that we'll be asked to endure. The love that we have for Christ motivates us through great trials because we recognize that God does not call us to be successful, He calls us to be faithful. And sometimes fidelity might look like defeat. And maybe we're supposed to go through defeat, but we're never defeated as long as we continue forward in love. Failure is not a real word for a Christian. Where there is love, there is God. And where there is God, there is victory. And therefore, it's our job to put love into everything that we do. Love for Christ. And like St. Paul, we might have to stare down death, but we will rise again. A Christian does not cower in front of the world. Christians face their fears and tread boldly.
Whoa, And I'll tell you what, that's he always gives us a great lesson there. And I have no idea, Dave, how he manages to talk and play the harmonica at the same time.
Yeah.